My name is Stephen, I'm 33, and for 3 years, I lived a lie, believing my fiancée Clara was my soulmate and my brother Julian was my ally. But on a sunny Saturday in our Connecticut kitchen, Clara's phone accidentally connected to our Bluetooth speaker. Julian's voice suddenly blasted through, whispering a graphic, breathless secret that shattered my world. What did I discover when I cloned her phone that night? A secret beach cottage key, explicit voice logs of their betrayal, and my own mother's texts coordinating their trysts. In just 48 hours, my stable life completely imploded into a legal nightmare. And the mastermind? My mother, Helen, who sat calmly sipping chamomile tea from her favorite porcelain cup, entirely unaware that the trap I was setting would destroy us all. Before I do, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I like knowing who's out there. The scent of slow-roasted garlic and fresh rosemary drifted from the oven, filling the kitchen and carrying out toward the sun-drenched patio where the late afternoon light was just beginning to turn a warm, golden amber. It was a remarkably quiet Saturday in our corner of Connecticut, the kind of day that made you believe, if only for a moment, that life could be entirely uncomplicated. I had spent the morning mowing the lawn, carving neat, dark green stripes into the turf, enjoying the simple physical labor after a grueling 60-hour work week at my risk analysis firm in Hartford. From the kitchen window, I could see Clara sitting on the wooden porch swing, her knees pulled up to her chest as she hummed a soft, wordless melody while flipping through a bridal magazine. We had been together for 3 years and engaged for just 4 months, and to anyone looking in from the outside, we were the very picture of suburban stability. I was 33 years old, steady and perhaps a bit too focused on securing our financial future, while Clara was 30, creative, and possessed a gentle, artistic grace that anchored my analytical mind. Our wedding was set for the coming autumn, and every detail seemed to be falling into place with a quiet, comfortable ease. Even my mother, Helen, who lived only 10 minutes away in her sprawling colonial estate, had been unusually supportive, though her favor always seemed to lean toward my younger brother, Julian. Julian was 29, a landscape designer who built his entire identity around his rugged physique and charm, the golden child who could do no wrong in our mother's eyes. I never begrudged him that. I was content with my quiet life, my beautiful fiancée, and the home we were building together. I walked over to the refrigerator to grab a chilled bottle of Pinot Grigio to go with the dinner I had prepared, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the peace we had found. Clara's phone was sitting on the polished granite island, plugged into the portable speaker we used to stream jazz playlists to the patio. As I reached for the wine cork, the music abruptly cut out, replaced by a sharp, digital static. A notification banner from a private, encrypted messaging application flashed across the screen, followed instantly by the automatic playback of an incoming audio file. The speaker crackled, and instead of the smooth saxophone that had filled the air moments before, a voice began to play. It was Julian's voice, thick, low, and heavy with a raw, breathless intimacy that made the blood freeze in my veins. He was describing, in vivid and graphic detail, exactly what he wanted to do to Clara's body when they met later that night, explicitly recalling the heat of their last encounter in the back seat of his truck. My heart stopped as the recording transitioned seamlessly into Clara's own voice, a soft, giggling whisper recorded in response, telling him she could not wait to feel his hands on her skin again and that she would find an excuse to leave the house by 9 o'clock. The audio file ended with a soft click, and the jazz music resumed as if nothing had happened, the upbeat notes mocking the sudden, suffocating silence of the empty kitchen. I stood frozen by the counter, the cold bottle of wine slipping slightly in my hand, staring at the phone as the warm afternoon light suddenly felt freezing cold and entirely hostile. I forced my hands to stop shaking as I set the wine bottle down on the granite counter. The jazz music continued to play from the speaker, a bright and cheerful melody that felt like a physical blow to my chest. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my shirt, and walked back out onto the sun-drenched patio. I handed Clara her glass of wine, watched her beautiful, lying eyes crinkle with pleasure, and managed to smile back when she thanked me. For the next 2 weeks, I lived as a ghost in my own home, playing the part of the doting, hard-working fiancé while my mind burned with a cold, quiet fury. I watched her closely, noting the subtle shifts in her posture when she received a text, the way she would casually slip into the hallway to answer calls, and the sudden, suspicious frequency of her visits to my mother's estate. I waited for the right moment, and it came on a rainy Tuesday night while she slept deeply beside me, her breathing slow and even. I gently took her limp hand, pressed her thumb against the biometric sensor of her phone, and spent the next 3 hours cloning her entire digital life onto an encrypted drive. The sheer volume of betrayal was staggering, revealing not only the physical depth of her affair with Julian but also my mother Helen's active role as their coordinator and cheerleader, even offering them her private beach cottage for their weekend escapes. With the evidence secured, my sorrow hardened into a cold, calculating desire for retribution. I did not want a loud, dramatic shouting match that would allow them to spin the narrative, play the victims, or find excuses for their betrayal. I wanted to dismantle their lives with the same quiet, clinical precision I used to analyze failing corporations. I started with Julian. His landscape design business, which he bragged about constantly at family dinners, relied heavily on high-end residential contracts and a squeaky clean reputation among the local Connecticut elite. I used a tech-savvy contact from my industry to dig deep into his business finances and discovered that his financial success was built on a foundation of lies. Julian had been systematically using undocumented labor, paying them cash under the table while charging his wealthy clients premium corporate rates. Even worse, he had been bribing a local zoning official to approve permits for elaborate hardscape designs built on protected wetlands. I compiled the payroll discrepancies, bank statements, and highly incriminating text messages between Julian and the official, packaging them into 3 separate, anonymous files. I sent these files directly to the State Labor Board, the Internal Revenue Service, and the local Environmental Protection Agency. Next was Helen. My mother was a prominent figure in the local historical society and managed a prestigious charitable foundation that she used to maintain her high social standing. I spent several long nights digging into the foundation's public tax filings and matching them against her personal accounts. It did not take long to uncover a systematic pattern of embezzlement, cleverly disguised as travel expenses and consulting fees for charity events that had never actually occurred. I packaged this financial data into a neat, undeniable portfolio and sent it directly to the Foundation's Board of Directors and the State Attorney General's office. I watched from the shadows as the invisible gears of justice began to grind, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the final blow to Clara. The invisible gears of justice began to turn with a slow, grinding force that was as beautiful as it was terrifying to behold. For the first few days after I sent the anonymous packages, nothing seemed to change on the surface, but I knew the bureaucratic machinery of the state was already in motion. I kept my head down at my risk analysis firm, working my usual long hours, while secretly monitoring the local news and the quiet, frantic shifts in my family's behavior. The first tremor of the coming earthquake hit Julian exactly 17 days after my disclosures. It was a Thursday morning when 3 unmarked white sedans and a state police cruiser pulled into the gravel driveway of his landscape design office. I knew this because I had hired a private investigator to keep an eye on the property, and the real-time photos sent to my burner phone showed state investigators carrying boxes of financial ledgers and computer hard drives out of his building. By that afternoon, Julian's personal and business bank accounts had been frozen under a temporary asset forfeiture order. The panic in his voice was palpable when he called Clara that evening, unaware that I was listening to every word through the monitoring software I had installed on her phone. He was hyperventilating, babbling about a sudden audit and demanding to know if she had mentioned anything to anyone about his cash-in-hand arrangements. Clara, sitting on our living room sofa while I pretended to read a book nearby, kept her voice in a hushed, terrified whisper, assuring him she had been completely silent. She looked pale, her fingers trembling as she twirled her engagement ring, completely unaware that the man sitting across from her was the architect of her lover's ruin. Within 48 hours, Julian's high-paying clients, who comprised the wealthy elite of our Connecticut suburb, began canceling their contracts one by one. In our social circle, a reputation for tax evasion and employing undocumented workers was a social death sentence, and no one wanted their pristine lawns associated with a state investigation. Julian's least heavy machinery was repossessed by the end of the week, leaving his yard empty and his business effectively dead. The collapse of my mother's carefully constructed world followed a similar, devastating trajectory. Helen had spent 30 years building an image of a benevolent, high-society matriarch, but that image was entirely dependent on her position as the executive director of the local Historical Preservation Foundation. On a Tuesday afternoon, the board of directors called an emergency closed-door meeting. The portfolio of financial discrepancies I had sent them was too thorough to ignore, detailing over $85,000 in unauthorized personal expenses, lavish spa days disguised as donor outreach, and fictitious consulting fees paid to shell companies. Rather than face a public trial that would destroy the foundation's credibility, the board offered her a choice: quiet resignation and full restitution, or immediate referral to the state attorney general's office. Helen chose the former, but in a small, gossipy town, there was no such thing as a quiet resignation. Within 24 hours, her name was scrubbed from the foundation's website, and her keycard access was revoked. The local country club, where she had reigned as the undisputed queen of the social committee, quietly suspended her membership pending an internal review of her conduct. I watched her social media accounts go dark, one by one, as her former friends stopped returning her calls and invitations to charity galas vanished from her mailbox. She was isolated, disgraced, and drowning in a sea of her own making, yet she still had no idea who had pulled the plug on her empire. Clara's turn came next, and it was perhaps the most satisfying of all. Her position as a coordinator at the local art gallery was her pride and joy, a role that allowed her to rub shoulders with wealthy patrons and pretend she was part of an intellectual elite. I had sent a highly detailed, anonymous email to the gallery's owner, complete with time-stamped security photos of Clara and Julian using the gallery's locked exhibition spaces after hours for their private, physical encounters. The email also included copies of her work emails where she had coordinated these trysts on company time. The gallery owner, a stern and fiercely professional woman, did not hesitate. Clara was called into the private office on a Friday afternoon and summarily terminated for gross misconduct and breach of contract. She came home that evening in a state of absolute hysteria, throwing her designer handbag onto the kitchen floor and sobbing into her hands. I played my role to perfection, wrapping my arms around her, whispering soothing lies into her hair, and promising her that we would get through this together. As she clung to me, weeping against my chest, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. She was mourning the loss of her career and her secret life, while I was simply waiting for the final act of my play. The opportunity to deliver the coup de grace presented itself a week later. I called my mother, Julian, and Clara together, claiming that I wanted to host an urgent family meeting at my house to discuss how we could support each other through these sudden, mysterious misfortunes. I told them that as a risk analyst, I had been looking into their financial situations and believed I had found a way to salvage Julian's business and protect Helen's remaining assets. Desperate for any lifeline, they eagerly agreed to come. The evening of the meeting was cold and rainy, the wind howling through the trees and throwing sheets of water against the living room windows. I had prepared the room with meticulous care, setting up a high-definition projector and a large screen against the far wall, ostensibly to show them my financial recovery slides. When they arrived, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Helen looked 10 years older, her eyes sunken and her signature jewelry conspicuously absent. Julian was disheveled, wearing a faded jacket instead of his usual designer clothes, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their shaking. Clara sat beside him on the sofa, her eyes darting anxiously between the two of his family members, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch his arm before catching herself and pulling back to look at me. I poured them each a glass of wine, took my place standing near the projector, and smiled. I thanked them all for coming and said that before we discussed the future, we needed to look at the exact data that had brought us to this point. I picked up the remote control and pressed the power button. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright, white light across the darkened living room. The first slide that appeared on the screen was not a financial spreadsheet. It was a massive, high-resolution screenshot of a text message exchange between Clara and Julian, dated 3 months prior, detailing a physical encounter they had planned while I was away on a business trip. The room fell into an instant, suffocating silence. Clara's breath hitched, her glass of wine trembling so violently that the red liquid sloshed over the rim and onto her lap. Julian froze, his jaw dropping as he stared at the screen in utter disbelief. I pressed the remote again. The speaker system I had set up around the room crackled, and the voice memo I had intercepted weeks ago began to play. Julian's voice, raw and filled with a breathless, graphic lust, echoed through the quiet house, followed by Clara's soft, giggling whisper promising to betray me. I watched their faces turn from pale to an ashen, sickly gray. Helen sat up straight, her eyes widening as she realized the depth of the exposure. I did not raise my voice, I kept my tone calm, conversational, and entirely analytical as I advanced to the next slide. This one showed the detailed financial records of Julian's undocumented labor, the bribery texts with the zoning official, and the exact IP addresses from which the anonymous tips had been sent to the state boards. The slide after that detailed Helen's embezzlement from the historical foundation, complete with the bank routing numbers showing the stolen funds being transferred into her personal accounts. "You see," I said, looking directly at my mother, who was now clutching the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white, I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page. "You wanted a stronger man for Clara, Mother. You wanted someone who was present, someone with vitality. And Julian, you wanted to prove that you could take whatever you desired because you were the favorite. So, I decided to test that strength. I wanted to see how well your strength held up against the Internal Revenue Service, the State Labor Board, and the Attorney General's office." Julian was the first to break. With a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated rage, he stood up from the sofa and lunged across the coffee table toward me. But he was off balance, fueled by panic and too much wine, and his foot caught the edge of the heavy oak table. He tumbled forward, his arms flailing, and crashed face first into the hardwood floor. The sound of his nose breaking against the floorboards was a sharp, wet crack that echoed through the room. He rolled over, clutching his face as blood began to pour through his fingers, staining the expensive rug I had bought for the living room. Helen shrieked, rushing to his side and pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me, calling me a monster, a sociopath, and a traitor to my own blood. Clara fell to her knees on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands reaching out toward me in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Stephen, please," she begged, her voice cracking with emotion. "Nancy manipulated me, she kept telling me you did not care about me, that you were never home. It was a mistake, I swear it was a mistake, I love you, please do not do this to us." I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of disgust that she would still try to lie and shift the blame to my mother even now. I did not offer her a hand, nor did I offer Julian a towel for his bleeding face. I simply walked over to the front door, opened it wide to the cold, rainy night, and stood beside it. "The presentation is over," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the sounds of Clara's sobbing and Julian's groans of pain. "Pack your things, Clara. You have 30 minutes to get your clothes out of my house. And the rest of you, get out of my sight. I never want to see your faces again." Helen helped Julian to his feet, his shirt now covered in blood, his arrogant posture completely shattered. They shuffled past me into the rain, not daring to look me in the eye. Clara followed shortly after, clutching a hastily packed suitcase, her face ruined by tears. As the door slammed shut behind them, the silence returned to the house, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. I poured myself a fresh glass of wine, sat down on the sofa, and watched the rain beat against the glass, knowing that I had executed my plan with absolute perfection. The rain did not stop after they left. It continued to beat a relentless, rhythmic tattoo against the glass of the living room windows, a cold and indifferent sound that seemed to wash away the lingering tension of the confrontation. I stood by the open doorway for several minutes, breathing in the damp, ozone-heavy air of the Connecticut night, before finally closing the heavy oak door and turning back to the quiet house. The silence that greeted me was profound, a stark contrast to the screaming, sobbing, and shattering of lives that had occurred only moments before. On the hardwood floor, near the edge of the Persian rug, a dark, viscous pool of Julian's blood was slowly beginning to congeal. I walked to the kitchen, retrieved a bucket of warm water, a bottle of industrial-strength bleach, and a handful of white rags. Kneeling on the floor, I began to scrub. The copper smell of the blood mingled with the harsh, chemical sting of the bleach, a combination of scents that felt clean, necessary, and entirely justified. With every circular motion of my hand, I watched the physical evidence of my brother's presence dissolve into the soapy water. I worked with a slow, methodical precision, ensuring that not a single trace of his DNA remained in the grain of the wood. When the floor was spotless, I threw the ruined rags into a trash bag and walked upstairs to the master bedroom. Clara's closet door stood wide open, her empty hangers clinking together in the draft like tiny, metallic chimes. She had taken her clothes, her jewelry, and her shoes, but she had left behind the ghost of her presence. The vanity table was still cluttered with half-empty perfume bottles, stray bobby pins, and a silver-framed photograph of the two of us laughing on a beach in Cape Cod during our second anniversary. I picked up the frame, popped the back open, and removed the photograph. Without a single pang of regret, I tore the glossy paper in half, separating her smiling face from mine, and tossed both pieces into the wastebasket. I slept better that night than I had in months, untroubled by dreams, wrapped in the quiet comfort of a house that was finally mine alone. In the weeks that followed, the immediate aftermath of my vengeance unfolded with a beautiful, devastating symmetry. The local community, small and fiercely protective of its pristine reputation, did not take long to digest the scandals. Julian's landscape business was completely dead by the end of the month. The State Department of Labor had issued a formal stop work order, and the local newspapers ran a small but damning article about an unnamed local contractor facing significant fines for environmental degradation on protected wetlands. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that his remaining equipment was auctioned off at a fraction of its value to cover his mounting legal fees and back taxes. He had been forced to break the lease on his luxury apartment and, in a twist of poetic justice, had moved back into his childhood bedroom at Helen's estate, his pride entirely broken. Helen herself was a shadow of her former self. The Historical Society had quietly appointed a new executive director, and the local charity circle had closed its doors to her completely. She no longer frequented the upscale grocery stores or the boutique coffee shops in the town center. Instead, she sent a delivery service to fetch her groceries, hiding behind the heavy drapes of her colonial home like a disgraced queen in exile. Clara had vanished from the local social scene entirely, her termination from the art gallery rendering her a persona non grata among the wealthy patrons she had spent years trying to impress. I, on the other hand, was thriving. The heavy weight of suspicion and betrayal had been lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a sharp, focused energy that I channeled entirely into my career. My managing partner at the risk analysis firm noticed the change immediately. I was sharper, faster, and more ruthless in my evaluations, saving our clients millions of dollars in potential losses. Within 6 weeks of the confrontation, I was called into the corner office and offered a promotion to Senior Director of Risk Management, a position that came with a substantial salary increase, a generous performance bonus, and a brand new, company-issued black utility vehicle. I accepted the offer with a calm, professional nod, feeling a quiet sense of triumph. I was building a new life on the ruins of their betrayal, proving to myself and to the memory of my mother's insults that my quiet, steady work ethic was worth infinitely more than Julian's superficial charm. To celebrate my promotion and to force myself out of the isolation of my empty house, I began spending my evenings at a high-end athletic club in West Hartford. It was there that I met Zoe. She worked at the front desk, a 26-year-old graduate student studying sports medicine who possessed a sharp, no-nonsense wit and a complete lack of pretense. Unlike Clara, who always seemed to be performing a role, Zoe was entirely real. She did not wear layers of expensive makeup or pretend to care about high society gossip. She was athletic, direct, and had a quick, genuine laugh that made the remaining bitterness in my chest begin to thaw. Our first date was simple, a quiet dinner at a local diner where we sat in a vinyl booth for 3 hours, talking about everything from her studies to my work. I did not hide the truth of my past from her. I told her about the betrayal, about my brother and my mother and my ex-fiancée, though I kept the details of my financial sabotage to myself. Zoe listened with quiet empathy, her dark eyes steady as she reached across the table to touch my hand. She told me that some people were simply parasites, and that cutting them out was the only way to survive. It was the first time in a long time that I felt truly understood, and as the weeks turned into months, our quiet relationship became a steady anchor in my life. But the peace I had fought so hard to secure was an illusion, a temporary calm before a much larger, more devastating storm. The first sign of trouble arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 3 months after the night of the presentation. I was sitting in my office, reviewing a complex portfolio for a commercial real estate developer, when my assistant knocked on the door and handed me a thick, heavy envelope that had been delivered via certified mail. The return address on the upper left corner made my stomach drop: Vance and Associates, a notoriously aggressive, high-priced litigation firm based in New Haven. I tore the envelope open, my fingers suddenly cold, and pulled out a stack of legal documents. As I read the formal, typed words, the breath was slowly sucked from my lungs. It was a civil summons and complaint, filed in the Connecticut Superior Court. The plaintiffs were listed as Helen Vance and Julian Vance. The defendant was me. I scanned the pages, my eyes darting across the dense, legalistic jargon as the reality of the situation began to set in. They were suing me for computer intrusion, illegal wiretapping, invasion of privacy, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The complaint was incredibly detailed, listing the exact dates and times I had accessed Clara's phone, the specific software I had used to clone her data, and the financial portfolios I had compiled and sent to the state boards and the Historical Society. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the fatal flaw in my plan. In my desire for absolute ruin, I had overlooked a critical piece of state law. Connecticut is a strict two-party consent state for any form of electronic recording or wiretapping. By cloning Clara's phone without her explicit, written consent, and by recording the conversations in my own home without the knowledge of all parties involved, I had committed a Class D felony. The civil complaint argued that all the evidence I had gathered was obtained through illegal, criminal means, and that my subsequent dissemination of that information to their employers, licensing boards, and the public constituted a systematic, malicious campaign to destroy their livelihoods and reputations. They were seeking damages in excess of $2 million, as well as a temporary injunction to freeze my personal bank accounts and assets pending the outcome of the trial. I sat frozen in my leather chair, the heavy silence of the office pressing down on me like a physical weight. The very system of rules and analysis that I had used to dismantle their lives was now being turned against me with a terrifying, clinical precision. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling slightly, and dialed the number of our firm's corporate counsel, knowing that the battle for my survival had only just begun, and that this time, I was the one standing on the edge of the abyss. The mahogany-paneled office of Arthur Pendleton looked out over the gray, sluggish waters of the Connecticut River, a view that on any other day might have seemed peaceful, but today felt like the perimeter of a cage. Arthur sat behind his massive cherry-wood desk, his silver hair neatly combed, his face a mask of solemn professionalism as he reviewed the thick stack of papers Vance and Associates had served me. I sat opposite him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my knuckles white as I waited for his assessment. The silence in the room was broken only by the quiet hum of the heating system and the occasional rustle of paper. When Arthur finally looked up, there was no reassurance in his eyes, only the cold, hard reality of a seasoned defense attorney who knew when his client had stepped into a minefield. He explained that while the financial crimes of my brother and mother were entirely real, and their moral betrayal of my trust was absolute, the state of Connecticut did not care about hurt feelings or broken hearts when it came to the law. Under Connecticut General Statute Section 52570D, the unauthorized interception of telephonic communications was a severe civil offense, carrying heavy punitive damages and mandatory attorney fees. By cloning Clara's phone and installing monitoring software without her explicit, written consent, I had crossed a line that transformed me from the victim into the perpetrator in the eyes of the court. Arthur did not mince words, He told me that Richard Vance was a predatory litigator who specialized in using the strict privacy laws of the state to shield wealthy, corrupt individuals by turning the focus entirely onto the methods of their exposure. The legal strategy was clear and devastatingly simple. They were going to argue that all the financial audits, the tax fraud discoveries, and the embezzlement portfolios were the fruits of a poisonous tree, obtained through a malicious, illegal campaign of high-tech stalking that had caused millions of dollars in damages to my family's businesses and personal reputations. The first physical blow of their counteroffensive landed less than a week later. A judge signed a temporary restraining order that immediately froze my personal investment accounts, leaving me with access to only a small, court-approved allowance for basic living expenses. The shock of seeing my hard-earned savings locked away behind a legal firewall was a cold bucket of water to my face, but the professional fallout was even worse. The managing partners at my risk analysis firm, terrified of the reputational damage that a high-profile civil lawsuit involving felony-level wiretapping allegations could bring to their boutique brand, called me into a private meeting. The tone was vastly different from the celebratory atmosphere of my recent promotion. The managing partner, a man who had praised my analytical mind just weeks before, refused to look me in the eye as he informed me that I was being placed on indefinite, paid administrative leave pending the resolution of the civil litigation. My company-issued utility vehicle was recalled immediately, and I was escorted from the building by security, carrying my personal belongings in a cardboard box. The humiliation was a physical weight in my chest as I walked out into the cold October drizzle, realizing that the professional life I had worked so hard to build was crumbling around me, all because I had allowed my desire for vengeance to override my analytical caution. The isolation of my empty house became a breeding ground for anxiety, but Zoe remained the one steady light in the gathering darkness. She did not judge me when I told her about the lawsuit or the frozen accounts, nor did she pull away when the local suburban newspaper published a sensationalized article about the case. The headline, which framed me as a jealous, tech-obsessed ex-fiancé who had launched a systematic hacking campaign to destroy his family, was a masterpiece of public relations spin orchestrated by Richard Vance. Zoe sat with me on the living room floor, her hand resting on my shoulder as we read the printed lies. She told me that the truth would eventually come out, but even in her supportive words, I could detect a faint, underlying note of concern. She was a simple, honest person who hated dishonesty, and the sheer complexity and darkness of the warfare between me and my family was foreign to her. I could see the toll the stress was taking on her, the way her quick, genuine laugh was slowly being replaced by a quiet, watchful worry. I hated myself for dragging her into my storm, but I was too far deep in the quicksand to pull myself out. The true trial by fire came during the deposition, held in a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 12th floor of a high-rise in downtown New Haven. I sat at one end of the long conference table, flanked by Arthur Pendleton, while Richard Vance sat at the other, looking every bit the high-priced mercenary he was. Beside him sat my mother, Helen, looking impeccably dressed in a tailored cream suit, her face serene and triumphant. Julian sat next to her, his nose healed but slightly crooked from the break, his eyes burning with a smug, vengeful satisfaction. Clara sat at the far end, looking small and fragile in a conservative navy dress, her eyes downcast as she played the role of the traumatized victim for the court reporter's camera. For 6 grueling hours, Vance systematically dismantled my character, using my own meticulousness against me. He presented my analytical spreadsheets, my detailed timelines of their movements, and the exact logs of my phone access, painting a picture of an obsessive, controlling monster who could not accept that his fiancée had fallen out of love with him. Every time Arthur objected, Vance would simply smile, rephrase the question, and continue to hammer away at the illegality of my surveillance. He asked me, under oath, if I had enjoyed watching them, if I had compiled the financial dossiers out of a desire for justice or a pathological need to inflict pain. I had to sit there, swallowing my rage, forced to answer with calm, legalistic denials while my mother watched me with a chilling, victorious smirk. The climax of the legal battle arrived at the preliminary injunction hearing in early December. The courtroom was cold, the air smelling of old paper and floor wax, as Judge Abernathy, a stern, elderly jurist with a reputation for a strict interpretation of the letter of the law, took his place on the bench. Arthur Pendleton argued passionately that my actions, while technically in violation of the wiretapping statute, were a direct response to a profound betrayal and that the financial crimes I had uncovered were of significant public interest. But Judge Abernathy was unmoved. When he delivered his preliminary ruling, his voice was dry and completely devoid of emotion. He stated that while the moral conduct of the plaintiffs was undoubtedly reprehensible, the court could not and would not condone self-help vigilante justice carried out through illegal, criminal means. He ruled that the right to privacy was a fundamental cornerstone of state law, and that by utilizing illegal wiretapping to gather evidence, I had committed a clear civil wrong. The judge upheld the temporary injunction freezing my assets, ordered that all illegally obtained evidence be suppressed and excluded from any future proceedings, and ruled that the plaintiffs had a high probability of success on the merits of their invasion of privacy claim. He set a date for a full jury trial to determine the exact amount of damages I would have to pay to my mother, my brother, and the woman who had cheated on me. As we walked out of the courthouse, the cold winter wind whipped across the plaza, biting through my coat. I stood on the concrete steps, watching as Helen, Julian, and Clara walked toward a waiting town car. Before she got in, my mother turned back to look at me. She did not scream or curse, she simply raised her chin, her face illuminated by the harsh streetlights, and blew me a mock kiss. Julian laughed, slinging an arm around Clara's shoulders as he helped her into the back seat. They had lost their business, their reputation, and their social standing, but through the cold, unfeeling machinery of the legal system, they had found a way to take my career, my savings, and my future. I stood there in the freezing dark, realizing with a sickening, hollow dread that in my absolute certainty of my own intellectual superiority, I had walked directly into the trap they had set for me, and that the ultimate victory would belong to the monsters who had started it all. The winter of my defeat was the coldest I could remember. The damp, biting winds of December quickly turned into the frozen, gray slush of January, perfectly mirroring the slow death of the life I had tried to rebuild in Connecticut. Every morning, I woke up to the quiet, freezing hum of an empty house that no longer felt like a home, but rather a crime scene where my future had been systematically executed. The legal bills from Arthur Pendleton's office arrived with a terrifying, rhythmic regularity, each invoice chipping away at the small, court-approved allowance I was permitted to access from my frozen accounts. Arthur's face during our weekly consultations in New Haven grew increasingly grim. He explained that the preliminary injunction had set a devastating, almost insurmountable precedent. The judge's ruling had effectively stripped us of our primary defense, leaving us completely exposed to a civil jury trial that would not only drain every single penny I had ever earned but would almost certainly result in the state's attorney filing formal criminal charges against me for Class D felony wiretapping. The threat of prison, of a permanent criminal record that would bar me from ever working in financial risk management again, was a gun held directly to my head. Richard Vance knew this, and he used that leverage with a cruel, mathematical precision, sending over settlement demands that were not designed to negotiate, but rather to strip me completely bare. To avoid a public trial and the very real possibility of criminal prosecution, I was eventually forced to sign my own financial death warrant. The terms of the out-of-court settlement were brutal and uncompromising. I had to agree to pay a staggering sum to Clara for emotional distress and invasion of privacy, and an equally offensive amount to Julian and Helen to settle their claims of tortious interference with their business relations. To raise the capital necessary to satisfy these demands, I was forced to sell the suburban house, the beautiful, oak-beamed home where I had mowed the lawn on that fateful Saturday, the very home where Clara and I were supposed to raise our children. Because of my desperate financial situation, I had to accept an offer that was tens of thousands of dollars below its actual market value just to expedite the sale. After the bank cleared the remaining mortgage and Arthur Pendleton's firm took their hefty share for legal fees, almost nothing remained of the equity I had spent years of 60-hour work weeks building. The physical process of packing my life into cardboard boxes was a slow, agonizing torture. I stood in the empty, echoing living room, staring at the faint, scrubbed spot on the hardwood floor where Julian's blood had stained the wood, realizing with a bitter taste in my mouth that my calculated vengeance had cost me everything I owned. Zoe tried to stand by me through those dark, exhausting weeks, but the toxic gravity of my family's hatred was simply too strong for our young relationship to survive. The constant stress, the late-night phone calls with desperate lawyers, and the dark, obsessive moods that took hold of me began to erode the simple, honest connection we had built at the athletic club. One evening in late January, after a particularly grueling deposition preparation session that had left me shaking with quiet rage, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes filled with a deep, exhausted sadness. She told me she loved the man she had met, but that man was slowly being consumed by a bitter, vengeful ghost. She said she could not live in the shadow of my ruin anymore, and I simply did not have the strength or the pride left to beg her to stay. When she packed her small bag and walked out of my life, I did not cry. I had become completely numb, a hollow shell of a man who had sacrificed his own happiness on the altar of revenge. In February, I left Connecticut behind, driving north toward Massachusetts in a rented utility truck containing the meager, plastic-wrapped remnants of my existence. I found a small, sterile, one-bedroom apartment in downtown Boston, overlooking the gray, industrial expanse of the harbor. The apartment had cold concrete floors, exposed brick, and large, drafty windows that let in a pale, indifferent light, a space that felt as blank and empty as my own chest. Through a contact at my firm's corporate headquarters who felt a lingering sense of pity for my situation, I managed to secure a transfer to the Boston branch. It was not the glorious, high-profile promotion I had celebrated months earlier, it was a lateral move, a quiet, shameful reassignment to a lower-profile risk assessment team where my legal troubles would not embarrass the company's local clients. The managing partners in Boston treated me with a distant, cautious professionalism, keeping me away from high-value accounts and burying me in tedious, low-risk portfolios. I worked 50, 60, sometimes 70 hours a week, throwing myself into the dry, numerical data in a desperate attempt to drown out the silence of my empty apartment. By the time the cherry blossoms began to bloom along the Charles River in late April, I had almost convinced myself that the dust had finally settled. I had established a quiet, monotonous routine that kept the demons at bay. I woke up at 5 o'clock every morning, ran 5 miles along the cold river, worked until late in the evening, and returned home to a quiet, simple dinner alone. I felt lighter, or so I constantly told myself. I believed that by surviving the financial ruin, the loss of my home, and the departure of Zoe, I had successfully purged the toxicity from my life. I had paid my penance, and though I was starting over at 33 years old with almost no savings, I was finally free from their control. The constant, suffocating anger that had driven me for nearly a year had begun to subside into a dull, manageable ache, and I believed that justice, though incredibly costly, had ultimately prevailed because I was no longer bound to the people who had betrayed me. That fragile illusion of peace was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early May. I returned to my apartment after a long, exhausting day at the office to find a certified letter sitting on the small table in the lobby. The envelope bore the logo of my insurance provider, the massive conglomerate that held my homeowners and umbrella liability policies from my time in Connecticut. I carried the letter up to my apartment, poured myself a glass of cheap whiskey, and tore the envelope open, expecting a routine update on the cancellation of my old policies. Instead, the document inside was a formal notice of claim resolution, and as I read the typed words, a familiar, icy dread began to spread through my chest. The letter detailed the final financial payouts of the civil settlement. Because the lawsuit filed by Helen, Julian, and Clara had included claims of negligent invasion of privacy and unintentional emotional distress alongside the intentional charges, my high-limit umbrella liability policy had been triggered. To protect themselves from a potentially catastrophic multi-million-dollar verdict at a jury trial, my insurance company's legal team had quietly negotiated a massive, pre-trial settlement advance with Richard Vance. The insurance company had paid out a staggering sum of $950,000 to the plaintiffs, split evenly among my mother, my brother, and my ex-fiancée. Because the settlement was negotiated and paid by the insurance provider under the terms of my policy, it was completely tax-free for them, and it legally resolved all pending civil claims, effectively dismissing the lawsuit against me. I stared at the paper, the words blurring before my eyes as the sheer, monstrous injustice of the situation washed over me. The legal system had not punished them, it had rewarded them. Because of my illegal surveillance, they had been handed a near $1 million windfall, funded entirely by the insurance premiums I had faithfully paid for over a decade. But the nightmare did not end there. The second page of the letter contained a brief, dry summary of the criminal proceedings in Connecticut. Due to the suppression of the illegally obtained phone data, the state prosecutor had determined that the key evidence against Julian for tax fraud and bribery was legally inadmissible. His defense attorney had successfully argued that the state's search warrant was based on tainted information, resulting in all criminal charges being dismissed. Julian was placed on a simple, unsupervised probation for 12 months for a minor zoning infraction, his record completely clean of any felony convictions. Furthermore, the state attorney general's office had quietly closed its investigation into Helen's embezzlement at the Historical Foundation, citing a lack of untainted financial records and a desire to avoid a costly, high-profile trial against a prominent local figure who had already resigned. I sat at my small kitchen table, the glass of whiskey trembling in my hand, as a sudden, desperate urge took hold of me. I had blocked Clara, Julian, and Helen on every digital platform months ago, but now, with a shaking finger, I opened a private browser window and searched for Clara's name. Her social media profile, which had been deactivated during the height of the scandal, was active once again, and it was entirely public. The very first post at the top of her page was dated yesterday, and as the image loaded, my heart felt as though it were being squeezed by a cold, iron fist. The photograph was stunning, captured in the brilliant, golden light of a Florida sunset. Clara and Julian were standing on the expansive, glass-walled balcony of a brand-new, ultra-luxury high-rise condominium overlooking the turquoise waters of Biscayne Bay in Miami. Clara looked radiant, her skin tanned and glowing, wearing an expensive designer sundress that I could never have afforded. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her hand resting on Julian's chest. Julian looked completely restored, his athletic physique on full display in a linen shirt, his crooked nose giving him a rugged, rakish charm that seemed to scream of victory. In the background, visible through the open sliding glass doors of the beautifully furnished living room, my mother Helen was sitting on a white leather sofa, holding a crystal flute of champagne, looking every bit the proud, wealthy matriarch she had always wanted to be. Below the photograph, written in a delicate, looping font, was the caption, "True love endures every storm, and justice always finds its way home." So incredibly grateful for this new beginning in our beautiful new home. I let the phone slip from my hand, the screen clattering against the concrete floor of my empty apartment. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled sound of traffic on the streets of Boston below. I stared out the window at the cold, gray harbor, feeling a hollow, crushing despair that was far worse than the anger I had felt when I first heard Julian's voice on the speaker. In my pride, in my absolute certainty that my analytical mind could outmaneuver the moral bankruptcy of my family, I had played right into their hands. I had spent months planning their destruction, believing I was the architect of their ruin, but in reality, I had simply been the catalyst for their ultimate elevation. My illegal surveillance had given them the perfect legal weapon to strip me of my savings, my home, and my career, while my own insurance policy had funded their luxurious new life in paradise. They had wanted a stronger man, a man who could provide them with excitement and wealth, and in my desperate attempt to prove my own strength, I had handed them exactly that. I sat alone in the dark, a bankrupt, defeated man, knowing that they were laughing at me from their balcony in the sun, and that the monsters had won.